Hello. So the video is over, and we are here. So welcome, and thank you guys for joining us. So the title of our session today is Investment Strategies That Leverage the Longevity Society. And we've consciously chosen longevity, not older and aging, because we actually like the word longevity better, but we can debate that. And part of the conversation we're going to have today is that there are really multiple perspectives on longevity and aging. On the one hand, there's a voice of investors that feel deeply that we are all going to thrive and do well because we are going to make a lot of money off this population of older workers and older people, and that these older people actually represent a cohort and a constituency that's quite important to us. But on the flip side, these older people and older workers actually represent a part of human capital that heretofore has actually not been well represented. If you really look at it through any lens, a data point that's interesting to me, and I apologize, I'm Pat Milligan from Mercer, but older workers are the single group left in the business environment that has no representation in the corporate world from a diversity and inclusion perspective. It is the only unrepresented and underrepresented part of the workforce. I'm not going to cite the numbers because the panelists here are all experts about how many people will there be with what kind of life expectancies and skills. And I'm actually going to spend a little bit more time with them looking at what are these opportunities, and also what are the mixed messages that corporations and society send around aging and longevity. So let's dive in. And I'm going to actually I'm going to start with the broad question about defining the difference between longevity and aging, because we are all excited about the word longevity, but we're actually not very excited about the word aging. So I'm going to mix it up, and I just learned a good definition in our little pre-panel. So Professor Scott, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. I think many people have hopefully seen your book and read your book, but I wanted you to at least start the conversation with why should I be excited about the longevity path I have in front of me, but not as excited about aging?
Thank you for the introductions. I'm Andrew Scott, economics professor at London Business School, and with Linda Grattan, the co-author of The 100-Year Life. I, as a macroeconomist, are interested in big trends that shape the world around us and that often creates investment opportunities. And I've long been interested in longevity. So to answer the homework question, I think aging, I'm kind of keen to almost drop it because it's kind of not a very informative word. First of all, everyone's aging. I mean, chronologically, whether you're 1 or 99, everyone's aging, and everyone's aging at the same rate. So chronologically, the concept of aging is not terribly interesting. Secondly, if you look at people as they get older, they actually are aging biologically at very different rates. So it's not a very homogeneous phrase to use. And then I think if you look at really what's happening at an individual level over the last 100 years, is kind of almost the opposite of aging. We're sort of younger for longer. If you look at mortality risks and health, people are healthier, on average, are healthier for longer, and they're living for longer. So to call that aging seems to be a fundamental misrepresentation. There's kind of two things that are happening. There's a big baby boomer cohort, particularly in the States, who are moving through society, and that is leading to an increase in the average age of society. But the other thing is that everyone, not just the baby boomers, is having this advantage of longer lifespans, and as Jim will point out later, perhaps even further is yet to come. So longevity is about all of life. Aging tends to be seen as about end of life. What is really happening with longevity is we have a lot more time. And with that extra time, we will restructure what we do. We're already seeing that restructuring happening. You look at people who are being employed in their 70s as the proportion is rising. In the UK now, you're more likely to have a child in your 40s as a woman than under 20. We're seeing all sorts of deep-seated changes right the way through life. And that is kind of a bit like technology, because what's going to happen with longevity is, on average, we're living longer and we're more productive for longer. That actually has to be good news for the economy, which brings investment opportunities. And of course, if we're going to see new ages and new stages, we're going to see new products and new providers. Take my profession, education. We're going to have to see a lot more provision of education in later years, and that's a market that is not well served right now. So just like technology, it's got big aggregate implications, big distributional implications, but we'll see a raft of new products and new services arrive. So longevity all of life, aging tends to be about end of life.
So Jim Mellon, chairman of Burnbrae and the builder of lots of different kinds of businesses with lots of success, and you shared some perspectives on the phone the other day about at least opened my mind that the definition of longevity that we're all planning for, you think will be obsolete before we even understand it because of the progress in science. So why don't you share with us some of the views that you see, because it actually does make it very difficult to coach. I've got a 30-year-old who's asking me, what horizon should I be planning for as I start saving for my future, and I'm actually not quite sure what to tell him, so I'm going to have him connect with Jim. So,
well, I've written a sort of companion manual to Andrew's excellent book, The 100-Year Life, which is heavy on the science of longevity. And it took me a year to research it, and especially as a non-scientist, that's quite difficult. But I did have the opportunity, and if you're an author, it's much easier to get access to key opinion leaders, to meet almost all of them in the longevity science area. And my firm conviction is that barring plague, wars, famine, etc., the usual human panoply of disasters, that within 30 years, average life expectancy on this planet in the developed world will be 110 to 120. And very few people are taking that into account. And that's based on science that exists today. It's not based on the science that we all read about that's future science, like gene editing based on CRISPR-Cas9, or stem cells, or organ transplantation from animals into humans, or whole tissue regeneration. It's based on stuff that we have today that's either commercially available or will shortly become commercially available, as well as some other trends, like a trend towards, believe it or not, healthier living in the developed world, which is happening at the moment. Less sugar consumption, and most importantly, less tobacco consumption. So I'm absolutely convinced that this is going to happen, and it's not such a big ask, because after all, life expectancy has doubled since 1900. So going to 110 or 120 is not such a big ask, except that it's going to occur as a result of molecular manipulation as opposed to environmental manipulation. So with that in mind, the trajectory of our lives, which is to be born, to learn, to earn, to sometimes burn out, to retire and to expire, is going to change. And that's why I said that we make good companions in terms of our books, because Andrew explains the societal impact very, very well of what this means for humanity.
So with that perspective, then there's the practical reality of how do we as business leaders prepare our organizations to manage these cohorts through their life cycle, and how do we ensure that people know how we really feel about their work and their participation in the workforce. So I'm going to ask Ben for you to start, because you have a very strong view about longevity given your role at the ILC. But love you to share kind of some of the biases and things I think you and I very similarly see. You set up a framework that should give us a lot of optimism, but the real reality of how organizations are managing the challenges to the population, we are so far from that, that it's almost a great divide right now.
Absolutely. So the longevity sort of revolution is obviously with us, and we've heard some sort of positive messages so far, but I think we are kind of failing to grasp the nettle on this issue in a big way. If we look at the world of work, for example, a lot of it is still 9 to 5. Inbuilt flexibility is okay in some companies and quite poor in others. There's a long-standing belief in the fact that there's a fixed number of jobs in the economy, and there aren't. That's the lump of labour fallacy, and that is a debate that we see both in terms of older workers, but also in terms of migration. On the health front, we've seen big cuts to prevention spending, especially during the austerity period, but clearly it's health prevention that's going to be the key thing to not just extend lives, but extend the healthy period of life so people can work for longer. We've had issues about long-term care, specifically in the UK, but right across the world, this is an increasingly big problem. There's not been great innovations in housing. There are in some very specific areas, but they're not being diffused across the entire economy as well. So absolutely, there's loads of opportunities in here, but we're still not grasping the nettle in terms of really getting and adapting our society ready for this big transition. And I think maybe that's one of the key sort of reasons why over the last 10 years or so, we've actually seen a kind of productivity stagnation across developed countries, not just in the UK, not just Europe, but worldwide. And really, for me as a kind of economist and expert in terms of aging, I do think that failing to get to grips with this is one of the key reasons why we are seeing this stagnation. So if we want to really improve investment prospects going forward, we have to think holistically about how to adapt the world for this huge revolution that's ongoing at the moment.
And so what are you, what are you advising organizations? How do they start? Because I do think that, and we'll talk about, the study of what are the biases about older workers, what is the real ambivalence. But as you look at organizations, and then certainly Mark will have you share your perspective, it's actually a topic I can't get any energy on. And so I'll share, a very personal, when you talk about diversity and inclusion, you talk about women, you talk about, I can get any board of directors to actually have a very complex conversation about diversity, about women, certainly now in the global environment, about sexual harassment. I can't get a single board to have a conversation with me about longevity. When I say, do you have a strategy for older workers? What's your point of view? Do you want them? Do you not want them? Literally, people look at me like I could be talking to them about something completely irrelevant to their business. So how do you start?
I think absolutely it's about having the conversation. I think we've done a number of kind of qualitative bits of work with industries that are aging fast. So actually it's in their personal interest to get the debate going, but they are scared about having this conversation because they don't know how. Line managers aren't necessarily trained appropriately on this front. And that's a real concern because these companies are going to lose invested skills and energies of these older workers who have experience, which is ultimately going to hit their bottom line. And many companies don't understand to what extent it's going to hit the bottom line. We know that a number of companies don't even measure the cost of that lost capital. They might count the cost of going to an agency to replace that worker, but actually in terms of that invested human experience of that worker, they're not actually costing that at all. So as a starting point, firms need to realize that it's going to cost their bottom line ultimately. And given that there's increasingly less slack in the labour market at home and abroad, it's going to be increasingly important for firms to hold on to those older workers.
So Mark, you've heard both parts of this conversation, and given your role at Aegon, you wear, you're like me, you wear multiple hats.
Yes.
And so I think hearing you talk about how do you, from a strategy and development perspective, think about the products, the solutions, but then we had the really candid conversation about then how do you look your older workers in the eye and say, what are you doing?
Well, maybe looking at the market side first, we do annual research among workers and retired people, and we do that in 15 markets. And we also ask retired people if they retired when they wanted to retire. And what we found is that 40% of them actually retired earlier than they had planned to. And the two main reasons were, one was unemployment, and the second one was ill health. So the health theme, I think, is a very important one. On the other side, it's clear that the old model of 25 years of education, 40 years of work, and then 30 or 40 or 50 years of retirement is not going to be sustainable for our societies. I actually had a great-grandfather who was a cavalry officer, and the Dutch army retired him in his 40s in the 1930s, and he was actually in retirement for more than 50 years, which was an expensive customer for the Dutch government. But that's not sustainable on a way. So we will need to move to a society where people will have longer periods of work, maybe taking breaks from work as well, I think, as in your book, to take care of children or parents, but be able to re-enter. So that's so much for the theory behind it, and I think we are starting to see some signs of more flexibility. And if I look at my own company, the most recent collective labor agreement, which we have in the Netherlands, which we negotiate with unions, it actually opened the option of demotion, which was not an option that was on the table, that people could continue work but with less responsibility than they had before. So that's one. A second one is my own industry. We are going to suffer net losses of employment anyway. Automation, robotization is still in full force, and the reality is we have restructuring round after restructuring round, and we are going to be a net smaller employer in the future than we are today. So when we think about our employees and what their future is, for many of them, that future will not be in our company. So the question is, how do we prepare people for a world outside our company? And that's where some of the efforts are. Having said all of that, I recognize what you say, that in practice, there are still quite a lot of barriers about talking about the fate of older workers.
So Andrew, how about if you build on that? I mean, one of the things I think you and I shared was that one of the fastest growing cohorts to come back to work are retirees. That if you look at entrance to the labor market in the UK, you look at it in the US, 30% of the people re-entering the workforce are actually retirees. So that's a fascinating statistic to me, is do we treat them, do we stay in touch with them? Do we know what they're interested in? Do we manage them as a cohort? I'd love to hear your perspective, and then we'll open it up and just talk through what else could we be doing, and then what are the investment opportunities?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about longevity as a trend is just how long it takes to respond. So this is a big social experiment. We don't yet know how to live the length of life that on average people are currently facing. So we don't know the right way to do things. We haven't got the previous generation to follow. Those people who have lived to 100 before, it's kind of been a pleasant surprise, hopefully, rather than something they planned for. So we don't know what to do. So we don't know the right things to do. And guess what? We respond slowly to it. And if you think about the different groups in society, corporates do tend to be the slowest to respond. Individuals the quickest, government's a mixture of far-sighted and short-sighted, and corporates slow to respond. But I would say we've seen actually quite a lot of change already. And you mentioned the case of people working after 65. I think the concept of retirement has already disappeared. The idea of a hard stop, that everyone comes to an end at work at the same time, at the same place, has changed. So some corporates are already responding, not enough, more will have to change. We're seeing a rise in people being self-employed after 65, there's a way out of that. I think also crucially you're seeing a reversal in Europe of people retire. There used to be a very big drop-off of people aged 55 to 65, withdrawing from the labour force. And that's a real challenge because people have been living for longer and retiring earlier. That's starting to change. It still is probably much lower than it needs to be, but I think we're already beginning to see some of this process occurring. A bit like technology, it always happens much more slowly than everyone would like it to, or that they say it should, because organisations take time to change. But we are beginning to see some of it already happening.
So Jim, you listen to both sides, and certainly you've got a perspective on what are the real growth and investment opportunities. Let's spend a little while and talk about, as organizations, what should we be thinking about and what should we be investing in? So.
Okay, I thought I'd start with a picture of two mice. The old mice, they're both old, but the one on the left has not been treated with what's called a senolytic drug. Senolytic drug removes senescent cells from the body. Senescent cells are almost entirely responsible for the burden of inflammation and frailty in old people. And it's now going to be possible within a very few years for us to take senolytic drugs and to look like healthy mouse on the right, who is exactly the same age as the decrepit, blind, can hardly move, fur all eroded mouse on the left. All right. So most companies and most people have the view of old age as necessarily being a condition of frailty, a condition of disability, characterized by one of the 5 key diseases of aging. And that is not going to be the case in the next 20 or 30 years. Old people will be much more robust, they won't be frail, and as a result they'll be much more important to the workforce, not only as consumers, because there won't be enough money to sustain them in retirement, but also as contributors because of their wealth, wisdom, and acquired skills. And I was very interested in what Mark said about demotion, because demotion or sideways moves in companies is going to be necessary because older people are not necessarily as physically strong as younger people and may do different things in companies. But older people will not just be hired, they will be required in companies. In terms of investment to sustain ourselves, Googles, there are two areas. One is what are old people or older people keen on consuming? And I flippantly say cruise lines because I think they're a one-way ticket upwards, basically. And short, for instance, nightclubs and bars, flippantly on the other side. But most importantly, the technologies and the pharmacology that will keep people alive for a very long time, which are the molecular manipulation of our bodies I talked about earlier, are going to be the best investments. It's like we're like in the internet in 1995. There'll be multiple failures, multiple charlatans, lots of disappointments. But out of that will come the Googles, the Facebooks of the new age, and they will be the biggest companies on the planet because there is no one who, confronted with the opportunity of spending 5 or 10% of their income for another 30 years of healthy life, almost no one will not take that offer. And that's why it's going to be such a huge industry and why we're so excited about it.
So do you think if we'd offered like free trials of these drugs in the room, we would have filled the house? Or
Probably.
Probably.
I've got some in my bag.
You've got some in your bag. But so if you think about that data point and about the fact that we are changing the definition of longevity, it links to a broader conversation about what are the myths of aging and longevity. Because, Andrew, you've talked about this, Ben, you've talked about this. Certainly at Mercer, we study this. So one of the things we really study is the actual productivity of older workers, right? We look at when you've got an older worker and you evaluate their performance on individual performance standards, depending on whatever their role is, speed to market, business, product innovation, development. On an individual level, factually, older workers perform at less productive rates than younger workers. But what we don't actually study is what is the impact of an older worker, and we say older, anyone over 50. When you put an older worker on a team, when you add that level of diversity, what happens to safety records, performance records, different kinds of metrics, and we find uniformly that the role of an older worker, and some of the work that we're doing with Milligan is looking at the performance standards of these diverse teams. But we have to start with the biases. So there are 3 very significant biases that we hit when we talk about older workers. First and foremost, they don't learn as quickly. So an older worker's capacity to learn is very limited. My hypothesis is you don't actually invest in an older worker. When you do focus groups and ask how many workers over 50 have been to a development session or a training program, very few. So first myth, older workers can't learn. Second, deep myth, they can't learn technology. So there are major issues about whether older workers can learn technology. And then the third, they have no tolerance for change and ambiguity. So what's our panel's view on those 3 issues? And are they myths or what level of reality should we be talking about?
I'm happy to sort of take up the point about productivity of older workers. I don't think there's any sort of a priori reason why an older worker should be less productive than a younger worker. There may be an issue about needing skills and retraining, and I think one of the sort of public policy adaptations and company adaptations that is necessary is to ensure that we have lifelong learning. And over here in the UK recently we had the industrial strategy, which is about raising the productivity of the UK economy in the long run, and it's quite pleasing that the government put adult skills and training as part of this whole process. So I think if we have the training system ready there for these individuals, because actually adult education in the UK has fallen and training in the UK for adults has fallen over time, if we reverse that trend, then actually we don't have to see this this kind of what's often recognised in the literature as a kind of inverse U-shaped consumption productivity pattern where the younger and the older are less productive than those of middle age. So I think there's no a priori reason for that. If we get the training and skills in place, then we can actually sort that out.
I think one of the challenges we've got, stereotypes are really hard to get rid of. And one of the problems we've structured life in a certain way where certain ages and certain numbers have a meaning, and that's no longer relevant. So for instance, in a 3-stage life where you have a linear career, then you learn at the beginning, you don't have to learn later. So one of the questions is, are older people incapable of learning, or is it just they haven't been using that for a long while? And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that older people can learn. They may have to learn differently, but they certainly can learn. But if you haven't had to change in 50, 60 years, then it's going to be very hard to suddenly change. So people are going to have to invest more in being able to, what we call, recreate themselves, whether that be through health, whether it be through exercise, whether it's through education. But we haven't kind of encouraged that before. I think, one of the deepest challenges we've got is that somewhere around 150, 200 years ago, society suddenly got interested in numbers as a way of determining people's age. And that's when government started to properly record birth and death dates. And then suddenly society became very, very age stratified. And what is so interesting about ageism, I think, is twofold. First of all the isms, ageism is one where you're going to be prejudicial against your future self, which is kind of strange. So that's a complicated one to try and overcome. But the sort of second thing is how a number, as you get older, isn't a very good predictor of behavior. The whole thing about aging is actually productivity starts to really vary. And most of the studies on productivity and age suggest that actually age is a fairly weak predictor of someone's productivity. Education and other things are much more important. Then the other problem I think we've got is what I call kind of the equivalent of age inflation. So as a macroeconomist, you can't compare the price of a bottle of beer in the 1950s with the price of a bottle of beer today. The numbers just aren't comparable. And I think we have the same problem when we use the word old. Because 65 was deemed to be old. In 1922, in the early days of UK pensions, a 65-year-old male in Britain had a 4.3% mortality risk. It's now 1.3. And if you're looking for the equivalent of someone today with a 4.3% mortality risk, it's a 78-year-old. So, we keep clinging on to these numbers despite the fact that so many things are changing. The average age of marriage in society now is more like 31, not 21. I'm told the fastest growing age rate for divorce in the UK is over 80. So, what we're seeing is that numbers no longer have the same meaning as they used to, but we cling on to them. And I think that's the biggest challenge we've got, because going back to the challenge that corporates face, if you look at what is actually happening, what kind of the message to get across is people of a certain age, on average, are fitter and more productive than they used to be. You should be more interested in them than you used to be. And that's kind of the crux of the challenge. This is the opportunity, but somehow we don't see it because we resort to these numbers that I think aren't meaningful anymore.
Yeah, having said that from the perspective of employers, I do see some issues, and it's not. It was part picked up on the discussion last night. We say, it's going to be pretty hard to retrain a 50-year-old truck driver to become a data analyst, and I think it's the skill mismatch of both younger and older workers with the type of skills that we need. Today we need data analysts, we need, web interface designers, we need, these, and that's the big challenge. And actually having people re-skilled in a way that their capabilities actually make sense of the businesses of today and tomorrow is more the challenge than aging per se. That's one. I think on the second, on the health, what you do see that I think, and again, I don't have all the stats to back it up, but typically I think older workers typically are conscientious, responsible, turn up for work, but the risk that they get sort of long-term illnesses is as a percentage higher than with younger workers, and the burden of that on employers, particularly SME employers, can be crippling, and that's where you see very risk averse.
There's been a shift though when that happens. Yeah. That's true, but being old now is 78, not 65, yeah. So there is a shift. And just on the retraining point, I mean, Jim was talking about the investment opportunities in the health sector. I do think that whole recreation sector. You saw the recreation sector developed in the 19th century, the leisure industry. Leisure as a consumption activity is now very standard. Leisure as a reinvestment opportunity is going to be huge. And I think the hardest thing about a longer life is going to be the need to reinvent and go through new stages. And that's a psychological challenge. And that's hard. And of course, the fewer resources you've got, the less education you've got, and the less your network is supportive, the harder it is to go through change. And that, to me, I think is the most challenging thing we face at an individual level.
So Jim, can you comment, because one of the things that I think concerns, a human resource consultancy like Mercer is we see very little, and I'll be very transparent about it, of all of the groups within an organization, we see virtually no reinvention of the classic training and development organization. When you look at who's really reinventing themselves to think differently about bringing new ways to learn to different cohorts, 5 generations in the workforce, I'd love to hear, because, and obviously we have not read the book yet, but if you think about so much of the economic opportunity is actually on the science side, reinventing education, and not just education in the world that you live, but education and lifelong development for older workers. Give us your perspective on what you might see as the opportunities, and I think, Ben, you've got a perspective there also, because if we can't break that nut, I don't see how we can take advantage of this population.
See, I slightly disagree with Mark, because I would say that, yes, maybe older people are not suited to be retrained as data analysts or something to do with computers and web design and so forth. But no one is, because frankly speaking, all those jobs, data analysts, web designers and so forth, are going to be automated out of existence. Right. And the jobs that will be important will be the artisanal jobs, the jobs in leisure and travel that Andrew talked about. But most importantly, the jobs that rely on human empathy. And who is better to convey human empathy than the people who have got decades of experience about dealing with people. Yeah. And I think those will be the prize jobs. At the moment, they're at the bottom of the heap. They're the minimum wage type jobs. But there will soon be professors of social care, degrees in social care, because we will need much more of that. And people will have much more time to do that. And it will be a much bigger industry. So I disagree in the sense that the truck drivers will not have a future. Of course they'll have a future. And that future will probably be in care, which we will need a lot more of.
From my perspective, quality of work is an absolutely critical issue. I mean, we've done some research to try and identify why people work beyond pensionable age in the UK, and a high proportion of that is actually whether they still enjoy their job. And I think that's something that's often overlooked in the debates about the financial incentives, etc. But actually, if you enjoy your work, quality work, where people have some flexibility, then we will see more older people wanting to continue working even after they've reached a kind of pensionable age point where the state might provide something and where their private pension might kick in as well. So quality is key.
And there is a virtuous cycle of success because being employed, your health condition improves, you stay better, you have purpose, etc. So these things we as well see as being very, very important also to ensure that financial security and health status later.
So let's try to drill down on financial security. I mean, we've been at this conversation for 30 minutes. We've talked about a lot of the elements of longevity, but given that I'm in the largest actuarial firm in the world, I've actually not talked about the pensions gap. Yeah. But we find, again, very little energy around what are you going to do to prepare people to pick up the financial responsibility that used to be filled by great organizations. If you look at the pension schemes and systems around the world, we are really creating a cohort of people who actually will manage their own life, their own wealth, and their own retirement, and they're woefully unprepared. And we have not seen that changing on a global level. So I think it's worth having a conversation about what is our response. If our responsibility is to ensure that workers actually are prepared for these longer, more productive lives, they have the skills, they have the health, that means that they're going to have to figure out their own life and wealth accumulation in a way that many of us had the benefit of great organizations helping us. And of all the products and solutions a firm like Mercer looks at, one of the least products that employees are interested in is anything around financial education and financial wellness. Yeah. Now, if you give them opportunities to double-click and get involved in anything related to physical and mental well-being, absolutely engaged. Anything around financial and financial well-being, very little take-up. So I can't decide if that's an avoidance process. They just say, look, I'm 30 or 40, I don't have to think of that. But if we look at this room and we ask the question, how many people in this room are going to have a defined benefit pension plan and in the future, and what percentage of your retirement planning is it? That's one of the single biggest life changes we're going to see. So
Well, first of all, if you rely on a defined benefit pension plan and Jim's predictions come out, you're doomed.
You're doomed, right? You're doomed.
So, I mean, the defined benefit is disappearing quickly, and I think we're not the only company, but many companies that still have exposure in that area are trying to sell out of it because it's things could turn for the worse. So it is more and more individual responsibility. People need to take care. In Europe, we often look at the US because the US is about 30 years ahead, maybe, in this transformation.
I would not look there. Not a good picture.
And if you look at the US, people are, woefully undersaved for retirement. So I think, and I do think governments in Europe, and I think the UK is somewhat leading in this, in trying to get the sort of nudge thinking, having auto-enrollment, auto-escalation, auto-everything, and make it as easy as possible for people not to make the wrong choices.
Yeah.
Plus education, but education is slow going.
So it's a massive challenge. I think nudges help, but I don't think there's a nudge big enough to fill the savings gap
Right.
for the sort of longevity we've got. And people are going to be just working later. I think that's unavoidable.
Yeah.
So in terms of how we provide pensions and financial security, there's going to be three different ways of doing it. One will be through the government. And again, I think we shouldn't just focus on finance, because if people are working for longer, they will need re-education, as you were referring to. London Business School provides that at a high-ticket item and a quality product, but that's not going to be available to masses of people. And I can see the government offering, just as we have maternity and paternity leave, paid retraining leave where you have a credit, and you may even see the resumption of adult education rather than just the provision of primary and secondary education. I think there'll be massive financial opportunities in the financial sector. I mean, how the insurance industry deals with longevity risk, there's a lot of money to be made there, but also there's whole new risks around. And one of the biggest risks we've got is that though on average people are living for longer and are healthier for longer, we have a new risk in town, which is I'm ill at 50 and I live to 100. And actually how I deal with that risk is going to become incredibly important, as well as dealing with the increases in longevity that might come that Jim's been talking about. I think the company one is interesting because, I think there is a limit to what government corporates can do, and certainly what they want to do. I've got a sort of vision of just reinventing the concept of the company pension. If you think about why companies introduced defined benefits, it was twofold. It was one, hey, I can recruit you now at a lower salary than I would do otherwise, because I promise to pay you some money later. And secondly, that's going to be a great retention tool. But if you think about a longer life, you've got to invest not just in your financial assets, but also in your health and fitness, in your education, and this sort of recreation ability. And so over my life, I'm going to want different stages to do things. So a corporation can offer a sort of a more broad-ranging portfolio of assets and say to people, hey, after 5 years, you take a 6-month sabbatical, you come back, your job is still open. After 10 years, I'll offer you 2-year retraining, and you can come back. So I think, extending the relationship between company and the employee in some long-term sense, and moving away from just financial assets but also to cover intangible assets, is a rather natural thing to do. It'll have the same benefits. It'll help recruitment because I can pay less for you now than I would do otherwise, and it can also offer as a retention tool.
So how do we change the conversation about longevity? I mean, we happened to run a longevity conference. Actually, it was called Aging in Japan 2 weeks ago, and about 2/3 of the way through the day, 3 or 4 CEOs said, this topic is just too depressing. Do we have to stay and talk about this for the rest of the day? No, we can talk about whatever you want to talk about. But there is a psychology, there is some psychological aspect of this conversation that people, you're yawning, but we don't want you to yawn, but there is some psychological aspect that it's one of the topics that either doesn't evoke from management or executives the level of passion that diversity does, or women does. So, I'm really interested in just a more transparent conversation about, it's almost like we need a marketing and communication and engagement plan around the whole topic, because even though you write books, it's just not a topic that people really want to spend time in. When I sit down and assess, I'm going to do an audit of your workforce plan, and I say you are woefully underprepared for your older worker strategy, they're like, just go tell me what I need to do. They don't really want to engage. So let's have that frank conversation about it. Is that because we all have kind of mental biases about there am I and I'm aging, or what can we do to make this a very positive conversation? And maybe, Jim, we start with some of your data, because we need to get energy around this, and I'm woefully not creating the level of energy, at least with my cohorts, that I'd like to be creating.
Well, everyone suffers from the trap of Tithonus, which is basically that this Greek god was conferred immortality, but unfortunately the immortality didn't come along with eternal youth, and so he got older and older and older, but he lived forever. And that's what we think of as being aging or longevity today. It's a fact that every time life expectancy rises by 1 year, the worldwide pension gap rises by $1 trillion US. And I noticed that British companies, because we've had a little plateau, and it's a very temporary plateau, by the way, in life expectancy gains, are all rushing to reduce their contributions to pension plans on the basis that we're not going to live this long, but they can put that in their pipe and smoke it, because we are going to live a very long life. I think that companies should be actually forced not to judge how much they put into pension schemes on an annual basis, but have to apportion a certain percentage of their profits for the provision of their older workers who will be retiring at 85 or 90, as Andrew said. And that should be, and in fact, in many ways, companies are making too much money at the expense of the labor force anyway. I'm not a socialist, by the way, but I do think that there's too much share of GDP and corporate profits and not enough in the provision for the labor force at the moment, and something needs to be done about that. And one of the ways that that could happen is by forcing companies to make a constant provision for pensions. We also happen to live in a zero return world. Especially in Japan, for instance, you can save as much as you want, but you're going to get a zero return on your assets. So it can be depressing, but it can also be an opportunity. But I would say that the insurance industry, which Mark is involved in, is going to be upended. It has to change. And even if they do longevity hedges, that's just transferring the risk to someone else. It's a zero-sum game. There's no positive benefit by doing longevity hedges. I would say that the banking system is going to be changed dramatically. And I would say that almost every pension scheme in the world is effectively bankrupt, because I have a very high conviction that our life expectancy is going to rise very dramatically. And there is no pension scheme that is sustainable. So we all have to save much more and save aggressively from an early age. There is no way around that. And we all have to work to 85 or 90 at the minimum.
It's interesting in how far there is a link between longevity and that zero return world, because most of our algorithms for how our pension plan participants should be invested, they automatically de-risk as people get closer to that retirement age. So with the whole baby boomer cohort going through, we're de-risking investment portfolios like crazy, and that's one of the things that's driving down these returns. And it's all based on this idea that people need certainty when they reach that mythical, that 65.
But I think there's a deeper link as well, actually. I have this idea that, we define the discount rate annually. I suspect people discount over the course of their life. Right. I think the longer you live, the more patient people get. So I think that's why over centuries you see the real rate of return coming down, because life expectancy is expanding. But going back to your point about how we make the debate more positive, you've got a tough sell to corporates. And I think individuals is where you begin here, and with governments. Because part of this will be, as with any big social change, government-led legislation and regulation and subsidies, whatever, to bring about change. But I do think, I'm sorry, danger of an author pushing their own book, but the book Linda and I wrote, The 100-Year Life, has been pleasingly very successful. I think we're up to about 300,000 copies sold. And I think that's because we talk about longevity, not aging. And aging is very important. We have very serious problems around social care and more old people. And they are, if you like, the first pioneers coming through and testing the new longevity that the second half of the 20th century produced. But actually, we've got people coming through who are teenagers who can live even longer. So we have to think about what is happening across all of life. One of the challenges we've got is the baby boomers, particularly in the States, are so vocal and so big that they're capturing a lot of the attention. But actually, we've got to think about how to adjust all of society for this. And this is an opportunity. If the punchline is, on average, people are living longer and healthier for longer, that surely can't be bad news for society. But somehow we've turned it into an aging society.
Right.
And I say that so captures, I mean, first of all, I'm not quite sure what it means for society to age. I think there's some whiff of society dying because it's getting older. But, people age and then eventually die, but societies don't. So there's a lot of negativity around it, where actually the very opposite is happening. We are healthier for longer. This is almost the inverse of an aging society.
One way of kind of framing aging in a really positive way is, a long time ago, John Maynard Keynes said we'd only be working 15-hour working weeks, days, for example, right? And as a result of this, everyone said, well, we've never reached that kind of utopia. But actually, if you think about all of adult life, so you include working life and you include retirement, and you average out the period of time that you're working and the number of hours you're working, you've actually got quite close to that level. But people aren't necessarily maximizing that period of time in retirement to do the things that they might want to. So we've done research and others have done research about something called the retirement consumption puzzle, where in the last 5-10 years, people aren't, consuming as they would have done in their 50s or 60s. It falls off a cliff, and that's for all kind of income quintiles. So a real opportunity in all of this is to support better kind of consumption smoothing, reducing those health constraints, finding products and services that actually support those individuals' consumption needs so they can live a long and happier later life in retirement as well. And that's not just good for the individual, but that's good for GDP as a whole as well.
Absolutely. So one of the things that Milligan, so Paul Irving at the Longevity Center at Milligan, one of the things that he really works on is actually how do you really get people to see themselves in these different lights. So don't take a 30 or 40-year-old and have them think about aging. Have them think about longevity by using technologies to show them the rat on the left is the rat you don't want to be, and the rat on the right is the rat you want to be. But let's talk a little bit about, in one sense, Jim, what are the technologies, because our experience is that if people can visualize the positive and the negative, if they can see, if I do these things at 30 and 40, I will live I will actually have the right level of wealth, and I'll be able to work the way I want to work. We don't manage that in any way as an integrated conversation. If you really think about it, we go after people on their health, we market to them separately on wealth, and then we leave it really up to them to continue to reinvest themselves. So one of the things that I think Milligan is trying to do through Paul's leadership is really think about, how do you think differently about what will a 60-year-old in 60 years be doing? What will it look like? So using artificial intelligence, some of the technology to get people to step in to what their new life could be. And I'd just like to, because I do think getting people to think differently about aging is going to be a big part of what we've got to do, and that's just not happening right now. The gap is just too large. Sure.
So the world's longest lived country is Hong Kong.
Right.
It's overtaken Korea and Japan, and it spends 5% of its GDP on healthcare. In the United States, which is at the bottom of the G20 in terms of longevity, 6 years adrift on average to Hong Kong, 20%, nearly 20% of GDP is spent. So this is not an issue necessarily of money. This is an issue of marshalling resources and also encouraging communities to integrate the young and the old and the middle-aged. So in Hong Kong, you have the bonds of filial piety, which still exist, and in the United States, you have anything but, basically. So old people are isolated quite often, and a very high percentage of healthcare is devoted to people who are over 75. Unnecessarily, there's over-intervention, as we know. So I think we need to address the issue of healthcare fundamentally to get to a point where we can say, older people will be more robust because we're spending healthcare monies more effectively. And you don't need to have 25 pills a day to be a successful ager. You don't need to have surgical interventions that are unnecessary. You need to have family and community support. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be very important.
I think picking up on that point, actually having smart health intervention is going to be absolutely critical for not just for individuals' health and well-being, but for the fiscal sustainability of governments as a whole. The strange thing, obviously, about the health market is if you create a new drug, you have new demand for it, so then actually costs rise as a result. So there can be innovation that actually can be inefficient and therefore lead to cost growth rather than anything else. And actually, if you look at health service spending, not just in the UK, but abroad as well, over the last 30 or 40 years, it's that technological change that has driven up costs to such an extent. So getting really smart about what interventions both increase efficiency while also improving quality of life is the holy grail in this area, I think.
But the type of interventions that recreate that social structure are the hardest ones. I know China, I think, has introduced a new rule that obliges children to visit their parents at least twice a year.
How's that going?
Yeah, you wonder. Because I think that's actually, it's probably the key to the solution, but it's also the hardest thing to engineer.
So I'm conscious that we've covered a broad gamut and a broad set, and we're supposed to positively open this up and get observations and questions from all of you. So we would love to, I think there's somebody with a microphone, but certainly love to hear the perspectives of people in this room. So so thank you.
Yeah, I hate to end on a gloomy note, but I just wanted to challenge the very concept of we're all going to live longer. And I'm not going to talk about diseases of despair like suicide and opioid addiction and drug addiction and alcoholism, although I think they are important issues in the West, which you didn't address. I actually wanted to pick up on something that Jim Mellon mentioned in terms of the share of GDP going to corporations and the massive inequality we see in Western society. And I don't know if you read it, but there was a book published earlier in the year by a historian called Walter Scheidel called The Great Leveller. And he looked at inequality down the ages from sort of prehistory to the present. And the greatest amount of inequality we've had prior to the current era were just prior to the Black Death and just prior to World War I. And his four horsemen of the apocalypse were pandemic disease, societal breakdown, violent revolution, and global war, kind of Hobbesian war of all against all. I'm saying, I'm probably sounding like a chap with a sandwich board standing on at Westminster Bridge saying he ended well his night. But how important do you think that issue of inequality, and what sort of derails this kind of Panglossian vision of a wonderful society of the best of all possible worlds in a kind of greying way? Thanks.
I mean, I think we're at a crucial juncture right now. So in the last few years, we've kind of seen a continual improvement in life expectancy and mortality rates in many developed countries. We've actually seen a slowdown of those improvements as a whole. Now, obviously, there are lots of new technologies out there that may well extend life far beyond what we already think is going to happen and what UN population projections, etc., show. But the real issue is, are we going to get the resources into diffusing those at a level that is mass market, that helps everyone rather than those who are just the elite and the wealthy. And this is a crucial moment in time where issues like prevention spending and getting that working appropriately are going to be absolutely critical, not just for the success of individuals, but as we mentioned already, overall public spending, etc., going over the next 40 to 50 years. So the moment is right now to be getting smart health intervention working for everyone and not just a few, I think.
If I can just pick up on that. I mean, I think there is massive inequality, and I think what Jim's been talking about and the stats I've been referring to, what's called best practice life expectancy, which is the country with the highest average life expectancy. And that shows a continual trend, and I think it will continue to show that upward trend. There are several countries, the UK and US, I think, being most prominent amongst the rich countries, who aren't following best practice because of inequality. And the gap between the rich and the poor is somewhere between 10 and 15 years in the UK. And that is completely inexcusable and has to be challenged. If it doesn't, we'll get the political reactions that the Great Leveller talks about. The interesting thing about the Great Leveller book, though, of course, you look over the 20th century, we've seen a doubling of life expectancy. In 100 years, it's included 2 world wars, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, rise of cancer and HIV. So even with that political turmoil, we've seen that rise in life expectancy and best practice life expectancy.
Good. Other? Please, jump in. Sorry.
I'd like to see the rerun of this next year, because when I saw longevity, on the description. That's what made me attend, not the word ageing. And the reason why I'd like to see the rerun of this, because I do actually think that governments need to introduce policy. That's the only way I think that companies will do something about it. But while companies are pondering whether they're going to implement initiatives or programs to encourage their people to save more for a longer life, some of the things that I'm seeing already taking place, I, with my daughters, go to a gym very regularly. I try. And one of the things that I've noticed that the demand is so high at this gym that I go to. When you look at the age spectrum, even I myself am staggered by how much the demand is. And because of that particular area in terms of health and leisure facilities has grown more than 15 times over the last 2 years.
That's amazing.
And what that has done, it has created more employment to serve that community. So what I'd like to see next year, if that's okay, if you want to share it with me today, that'd be great. Where do you think are going to be the best areas to kind of invest, or growth areas in terms of opportunities going forward?
Excellent. Thank you.
I think that the best opportunities to invest in the technologies which are pro-longevity, because this is a branch of biotech which is one of the world's biggest industries, and it's a branch that's extremely promising. And although we talk about the plateauing of life expectancy in the UK and the US at the moment, that's because we haven't yet seen these drugs which are in development coming onto the market. But if I refer back to the mouse, if you look at mouse models, for instance, you can increase the life of a mouse. And admittedly, mice are not human beings, but they do share 99.9% of our genes. You can increase the life expectancy of a mouse, and more importantly, its robustness by 60 to 65%. And of course, that's only going to increase. So we don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 years, but in the last 5 years, we've cured hepatitis. I say we, science has cured hepatitis C. Artificial intelligence has come to the fore in terms of developing new compounds, and used in diagnosis is extremely effective as well. And of course, we've had cancer immunotherapy, which didn't exist 5 years ago, resulting in biblical cures almost for cancer. So you've got remarkable scientific advance just in the last 5 years. Imagine what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years, and that's not taken into account in the projection that we're going to live to 110 or 120, which I think is a relatively conservative projection, albeit I agree with the gentleman at the back there. Who knows? We might have the 5 horsemen or the 10 horsemen of the apocalypse come along as well.
Jim, so very pragmatically, though, I think one of the things I would suggest is that if you look at any of the future of jobs or the workforce of the future research, whether it's the World Economic Forum, Mercer, McKinsey, it's got a very clear trajectory of, look, healthcare, home healthcare, any kind of retail and social jobs are growing very dramatically. And so I think there's a question of what's the future in the world that Jim sees. But if you're saying, where would I invest? I absolutely would invest at the intersection. The biggest merger in the US right now that's going to transform the way healthcare and fitness gets delivered is actually CVS, the drug company buying Aetna, the insurance company. That will be one of the largest transformations we will see. CVS will have a fitness center. They'll have a healthcare center. They'll now have pharmacies. So I'll actually go to CVS to do everything.
Yeah.
So it'll be if you kind of think I go to Walmart for this, I go on Amazon for this. If I want a physical experience and I want to work out, I will bet you in a year I'll tell you I've gone to CVS, because they will build fitness centers so I can go buy my drugs, take care of myself, get my screenings, and do everything in one environment. And that's going to challenge the role of Aetna, and other large healthcare providers. So I think there are 2 scenarios. There's Jim, your scenario, but if you say, where would I invest? I'd own a fitness center that actually does flu and wellness shots, has docs there, and I can actually do everything I need, and it's what I can't do on Amazon. So you divide your life in what can I do on Amazon and what can't I do on Amazon.
I think that's an example.
I mean, it really is. When you talk to focus groups, literally people will say to me now, this is how I think about this. What can I do on Amazon and what can't I do on Amazon?
But I think there's 2 issues there. I agree with that. I think the recreation industries is going to grow and grow and grow.
Right.
But I think there's 2 things. One is, where will the jobs be? And the second is, where will I make very large rates of return as an investor?
Exactly.
I think the jobs will be there, but getting us unique competitive advantage is going to be hard. But I think the really big investor returns will be in the longevity side.
There's a question right behind. Sure, please.
So it's another question, Jim. So given that knowledge is power, now that you know you've got another 50, 60 years ahead of you, what life changes are you now making with this newfound knowledge?
That's a very good question, actually. So far, not many. But I can tell you that everyone, this is a free tip, everyone who's in this longevity science area takes metformin on a daily basis. Metformin being a diabetic drug that goes back to 1957. It seems to be very remarkable in its pro-longevity qualities, but you have to take vitamin B12 along with it. I'm not a doctor, so I'm not prescribing it, but it might be something you might want to think about, and I definitely take that. Yeah, no noticeable side effects so far.
Well, so any final questions or queries? Sure, please, absolutely.
Thank you. I just want to extend the question from the previous questioner about what are the areas to invest in. Let's turn it round, and then the point you raised earlier on about investor behavior, or us, citizens. You said start investing aggressively from youth and work until you're 80. That's not happening. So what needs to happen to make that happen?
Sorry.
Yeah, no, Liba.
My view is that public policy has a crucial role to play in this. Earlier we heard about the issue of auto-enrolment in the UK. That has got people saving. When we've done comparative analysis of saving systems around the world, it really is public policy intervention that A, is through nudges, or B, is through mandatory and compulsory savings, such as Hong Kong or Singapore. It's those two elements that have to get the thing started. It's then down to the conversations with employers and other important stakeholders to get that level of savings ticking up. And as we heard earlier, given that we are kind of in a low returns world, it's absolutely about putting as much aside for the future as possible.
I mean, I think, this is the crux of the challenge about longevity. How do we draw a connection between myself now and myself in the future? And that gap's got even bigger. And that's a really hard task to resolve. I think, making people aware of lifespan is one thing. And, it really annoys me that governments continue to use period life expectancy measures, which seriously underestimate life expectancy based on current trends. So we don't do ourselves any favour there. So actually, one is just providing the information. There's some evidence that the 20-year-olds currently are actually saving more than past cohorts. Yeah. But in the end, it's not going to be saving, I think, because I don't think we're going to radically get people to have a different attitude towards money today and money in the future. It's going to be investing in health, investing in education to support a productive and a happy longer career. That'll be, I think, a relatively easier task than saying, don't spend money on yourself now, shift it to later.
So on that positive note, we see you in the back. So we are all wishing you a productive and healthy kind of lifelong life cycle. How's that? So we're not going to close. So thank you. Thank you.